wanted to take this opportunity now for my thoughts, because they really do come right out of the Haftorah portion that we just heard. But I like to begin by telling you of a time a few weeks ago when I traveled by bus to and from Washington, D.C. It is the practice on this carrier for the driver to recite a long list of the rules the riders must follow, each and every leg of the journey. On this particular trip, I only half listened to the speech. I am by now a bus riding pro, and I know the rules. However, this time there was new information pertaining to an emergency. We would know it is an emergency, she allowed, because she would just have yelled, "Every man for himself." Well, that got my attention. Not only did it get my attention, it held my attention for a good 30 or so miles into the trip. I have, thank God, never been in a true life or death emergency situation, so I don't actually know how I would respond, given adrenaline and fear and I'm sure the confusion around some kind of thing like that. But I do know that reports of accidents, especially grand-scale accidents which involve crowds of people, nearly always include accounts of people who have helped others, sometimes even losing their lives in the process. So while I understand that the driver wanted to somehow telegraph how we would recognize that an emergency was taking place, what she said, "Every man for himself," I don't think that ever happens, or I don't think it happens very often. With this in mind, listen to another story, also about a bus, but this one took place in Israel. The story is told by my friend, Rabbi Ron Klotz, the former director of Goldman Union Camp Institute, currently on the faculty of Indiana University. So he wrote this past summer. "This year we seem to be catching the 172 bus on Derech Hebron almost every day to travel downtown to Ben Yehuda Street. One day we jumped on the bus as usual, never expecting to experience a scene from The Russians Are Coming, The Russians Are Coming." So just as a side note, I don't know how many of you remember the movie The Russians Are Coming, but I have a funny story connected to it for another time. Soon after we got on, the driver announced that because the Russian President Alexander Putin was visiting Jerusalem at that very moment, the government had closed all of the main streets going downtown. He announced that he would get us as close as he could. It was funny that no one seemed to think that this was too unusual. We got on the bus expecting to go someplace, and it simply was going to take us someplace else. The driver couldn't tell us exactly where he would let us off. Although Israelis often yell and complain about any little thing, like the woman who gave the driver hell for stopping a bit up the block from her usual spot, at this major change it was no problem, and all seemed to accept that we were not going to end up downtown. We finally stopped down near the Jaffa gate of the old city, quite a distance from where we thought we would be getting off the bus. But just before we stopped, my wife, Juka, noticed an old man who was quite upset and confused by this change in route. Juka asked him if he would like to get off the bus with us so that we could help him. He was a 92-year-old American who had made Aliyah because his son and grandchildren were now in Israel. He spoke no Hebrew. He was wearing a World War II U.S. Navy vet's cap, and he was trying to reach the great synagogue of Jerusalem. We were nowhere close. We all got off the bus and were slowly making our way up the street when a cab driver approached. Strange things happen in Jerusalem, so I shouldn't have been surprised to see that the cabbie was wearing a Chicago Cubs cap. Did it matter to him that our beloved Cubbies were almost already out of the race and it was just the end of June? I imagine not. He probably didn't even know who the Chicago North Side Heroes were. Nevertheless, I immediately noticed the Cubs cap and commented to him in Hebrew that I liked the cap and that it was my team. Ron Klotz is a big Cubbies fan. The cabby wanted 50 shekels to take the old man to the synagogue. Our companion refused, saying through us that it was too much money, that he couldn't afford it. So up in the street, in the hot sun, we trudged, up Rehov Yafo, toward downtown. About 2 minutes later, we heard that same cabbie yelling at us. He called out, "Hey, Chicago, Chicago." Of course, he got our attention. When he caught up to us, he said that he would just take the old man to the synagogue. When I told him that he would have to take care of the gentleman, not just give him a ride, his reply was priceless. With hands outstretched and palms up, giving me an "isn't it obvious" look, he said, "Kamo Abba Sheli," Kamo Abba Sheli, as if he were my own father, as if he were my own father. Rabbi Klotz doesn't say this, but I hold that at the core of this story is the radical notion that everyone is Kamo Abba Sheli, as if he were our father. After 10 days of mindful self-analysis and tshuva, repentance, on Yom Kippur, we open our hearts to others. We are, as Rabbi Bisno is fond of saying, in this together. Our Yom Kippur prayers are spoken in the plural. We have sinned, we have transgressed, we have committed wrongdoings. And the message of the Haftarah portion that we just heard, that stirring, poignant, insistent Haftarah that we just heard, the message is of compassion. After a stern warning not to congratulate ourselves for being here today, not to be too pleased with ourselves about fasting if we can and if we do, lest we get too carried away with our own piety, the prophet Isaiah reminds us that the real purpose of all of this ritual is to open our hearts. Our sacred, difficult, and noble task is to operate as if every human being were our own father, our own mother. Rabbi Neil Joseph Levenger teaches, Isaiah comes and says, be careful not to confuse the outward sign of the tshuva process, the outward signs of this repentance process, with the real inner work. Don't confuse the day, which is the container, with the contents, which is humble acknowledgement of our imperfections and a commitment to create more compassion in our lives, despite those imperfections. Yom Kippur is the container. Our work is the contents. Yom Kippur calls us to open our hearts as if every other human being were a member of our family. And by every other human being, I mean those we know, as well as those throughout the world we will likely never meet. Let's start with those we know. I would like to talk a bit about the philosophy behind the Just Listening campaign explained briefly in the flyer that you received in the service pamphlet. The goal of this effort is simple. We want to grow closer as a congregation, and we will do this by listening to one another's stories. When we listen to one another with compassion and with an open heart, we will begin to understand the fundamental connections we have to one another. When we listen to one another, we will begin to notice that what hurts you hurts me. When we listen to one another, we will discover that what delights you also delights the woman 6 rows in back of you. What confuses or frustrates you is just as mystifying to the man sitting in Freehoff Hall right now. 19th century Jewish philosopher Martin Buber calls the kind of relationships we are seeking to cultivate among our congregants through our Just Listening campaign, I-Thou relationships. These are moments of connection, real connection, one person with another. When we listen, when we strive to understand and to know another person, we learn what matters to him. We recognize what hurts and what inspires her, what keeps them up at night, what blessings they know. Once we listen to one another's stories, we will clearly see that you are Kamo Ima Sheli, It is if you were my mother. You both worry about the same things. And you are kamo Abba Shali. You are just like my father. He was good at what you're good at. And really connecting with another human being links us to our Creator and leads us to an awareness of the divine. Our compassion begins at home. From there, it extends outward to those we don't know. We live and we work alongside others about whose lives we know nothing. We don't know who is frightened and alone. We don't know who struggles with physical or mental illness. We don't know who feels safe at home and who does not. And on this Yom Kippur morning, when those of us who are fasting are beginning to feel a bit hungry, we do not know who doesn't have enough food. Rabbi Alan Maller explains, the Yom Kippur fast teaches compassion. It is easy to talk about the world's hunger problem. We can even feel sorry for the millions of people who go to bed without food each night. But not until we really know some discomfort ourselves can we appreciate similar deprivation in others. Compassion based on empathy is much stronger and much more consistent than compassion based on pity. I would only add that compassion based on empathy is not only stronger and more consistent, but it is more respectful and it is more personal. You and I know intellectually that there are hundreds of families in our zip codes who are hungry. Yet even as we bring our donations to the Squirrel Hill Food Pantry and support the Empty Bowls dinner, both of which we do beautifully, few of us ever see outward, recognizable signs of hunger. That was definitely true for me, until that is a few months ago. The young mother in front of me in the checkout line at the grocery store intended to buy some food for her baby, but there was a problem. It took me a while to notice that my line wasn't moving. When I did notice, I witnessed the cashier attempt over and over again to make the transaction work, to ring up the 2 or 3 containers of infant formula the woman had put on the belts. So if he did it enough times, it would work. Eventually, the sensitive young cashier was forced to explain to this woman that her coupons would not pay for those particular packages of formula. I immediately became uncomfortable because I was aware of what was going on. The WIC program, Special Supplemental Nutrition Program for Women, Infants, and Children, covers very specific products only. Apparently, what this store carried and what this woman was allowed to purchase were not the same. The woman froze. She was unable to speak. That day, I saw what hunger looks like, and it looks like fear. That experience moved me to sign up for the Jewish Community Food Stamp Challenge. In November, just before Thanksgiving, Rabbis Bisnow Hertz and I, together with rabbis and cantors in communities across the country, representing all 4 major denominations, will each live for 1 week on a food budget of $31.50. The average allotment for individuals on Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program known as SNAP. The food stamp challenge is likely to leave us hungry. Or at the very least, we will not be able to enjoy all of the foods we usually eat without giving it a second thought. For a few days, we will know better real hunger. We invite you to support, perhaps even join this undertaking. I hope that the dull ache we will feel, the frustration we will undoubtedly experience trying to create a meal on $1.50, each meal is $1.50, will evolve and transform into compassion for the people in our neighborhoods, the ones kamo Abba Shali, the ones just like our fathers, and our children who are hungry. It would be enough to consider those we know and those we don't know as kamo Abba Shali, just like ourselves and just like those we love. But it's not only those we know and we don't know, whose lives may be transformed by our compassion. You and I are motivated every day by stories of other people's, sometimes total strangers, acts of generosity and kindness. And it is fair to say that we, sometimes without even being aware, inspire others as well. Our children and grandchildren, those with whom we work and play, they see what we do, and they take notice. They witness when we are kind, they notice when we are patient, they observe when we show compassion, and then they do as they have seen us do. This morning, our littlest children participated in a service where they watched and listened to an adapted version of a wonderful new children's book about tzedakah and gimilut chasadim, acts of loving kindness. In the story, throughout the story, a big sister defines these words to her younger brother. While we usually use words like righteousness to define tzedakah and acts of loving kindness to define gimilut chasadim, the sweet girl in the story had other explanations. To her brother, she says, "These words mean, I'm happy when you're happy." Later she adds, "They mean we're all one big family. It means I want your wishes to come true. It means I care for you." On this Yom Kippur, when we are motivated to nurture our compassion for those we know and for those we do not know, we are called upon to remember that we are all one big family. The man in the pew a few rows back, the one whom you haven't met, but I hope you will, his concerns are the same as yours. The young mother in the grocery store with a hungry child at home is kamo ima sheli. It is if she is our mother. Yom Kippur calls us to this truth. There is no every man for himself. We are happy when others are happy.